The attic was a treasure chest of forgotten fragments, where dust clung to the air and the past whispered from old boxes. Among the clutter of faded photographs and brittle keepsakes, I stumbled upon a VHS tape. Its label, written in my mother's precise cursive, simply read, "State Finals, 2010. Curiosity tugged at me. I hadn't thought about that year in ages, a time I'd long buried beneath layers of adulthood and self-doubt. Yet, here it was, a relic of my younger self, daring me to remember. As I dusted off the ancient player and inserted the tape, the screen flickered to life, showing a scene both familiar and foreign. There I was, 16 years old, stepping onto the stage with trembling hands, holding a project I'd poured my soul into, a breakthrough in early cancer detection. My name, Leah Cooper, echoed through the auditorium as they announced me as the first-place winner. I could almost feel the surge of pride that once lit up my chest. But then, the camera shifted. The grainy footage swung away from me to the far end of the auditorium, where my sister, Ivy, was rehearsing her cheerleading routine. My father's voice boomed from behind the camera. "Look at her form, Evelyn. She's going to crush the finals tomorrow." My moment of triumph faded into the background, swallowed by their adoration for Ivy. I hit pause, the screen freezing on my younger self mid-speech, half obscured by the camera's abrupt shift. The room grew unbearably quiet, save for the dull hum of the player. My thumb hovered over the eject button, but something kept me still. Watching that moment again reminded me of something I'd spent years trying to forget, how I had learned to live in the shadows of a family that never truly saw me. For a fleeting second, I considered throwing the tape away, as though discarding it could erase the pain of being invisible. But I pressed play instead, not out of nostalgia, but to remind myself why I had fought so hard to become someone worth noticing. If not to them, then at least to myself. When the footage switched to Ivy's cheerleading finals, the camera was steady, unwavering, capturing every perfect flip and smile. My parents' cheers drowned out the crowd as Ivy's team took second place. You'd think she had won the Olympics from their reactions. In the background, barely visible, was my science fair trophy sitting abandoned on a table, forgotten just like the girl who had earned it. I stared at the static when the tape ended, my chest tightening with an old, familiar ache. Then my phone buzzed. It was Mom. "Family dinner tonight. Big news about Ivy. Don't be late." Of course, it was always about Ivy. I glanced at my laptop where an unopened email from the biotech firm I'd been courting for months waited. Inside was an answer that could change the trajectory of my life. I hadn't opened it yet, though. Deep down, I already knew the outcome. What I didn't know was whether it would even matter to them. As I left the attic and stepped outside, my elderly neighbor, Mr. Harris, was watering his hydrangeas. His sharp eyes caught mine immediately. "Found something in that attic you weren't ready to see?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern. "Just some old home videos," I replied, forcing a smile. "Nothing important." He set his watering can down and shook his head. "Funny how memories work. Sometimes the ones we try hardest to forget are the ones that stick the longest." Something in his tone struck a nerve, but I nodded politely and headed for my car. His words lingered as I drove toward my parents' house. The old footage looped in my mind, but this time, I wasn't just watching my teenage self being ignored. I was seeing the moment I disappeared from my own family. The thing about being invisible, though, is that no one sees you coming. And for the first time, I wondered if that might be my greatest strength. The drive to my parents' house felt longer than usual, every mile weighed down by the loop of memories the tape had unearthed. The evening sun dipped low, casting the suburban streets in a golden glow, but it did little to warm the cold knot in my stomach. I knew what awaited me. Another shrine to Ivy's latest accomplishment, another reminder that my milestones were background noise in their lives. When I pulled into the driveway, the scent of freshly cut roses hit me before I even opened the door. Inside, the house was a whirlwind of preparation. My mother was at the dining table, carefully arranging a centerpiece of the same flowers. Ivy always loved roses. Everything was perfect, down to the polished silverware and embroidered napkins. The air buzzed with anticipation, like the house itself was holding its breath for Ivy's entrance. "Leah, you're here," Mom said without looking up. Her tone was casual, almost dismissive, as though I were just another piece of furniture she'd arranged for the evening. "Hi, Mom." I hung my coat on the rack, noting the absence of any greeting about my day, my work, or, heaven forbid, my life. "What's the occasion?" She finally glanced up, her smile tight and rehearsed. "Ivy has big news. She's been hinting about it all week." She returned to fluffing the roses. "Isn't it exciting?" I didn't answer. My gaze drifted to the living room, where my father sat, glued to his phone. The trophy shelf near the fireplace gleamed in the evening light, filled with Ivy's cheerleading awards, framed photos, and accolades. My own achievements, degrees, scholarships, even the national recognition I'd received for my cancer research project, were nowhere in sight. I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat and moved to help set the table. If years of being overlooked had taught me anything, it was how to blend into the background. Then Ivy burst through the door, her energy filling the room like a gust of wind. She wore a dazzling smile and thrust her left hand forward, the massive diamond on her ring catching the light. "I'm engaged," she announced, her voice as bubbly as champagne. Behind her, Jake followed with an easy, practiced grin that charmed everyone except me. "Oh, sweetheart," Mom gasped, rushing to embrace her. Dad was on his feet in an instant, clapping Jake on the shoulder. "Welcome to the family, son," he said with a laugh that echoed through the room. I stood frozen, holding a plate midair. The scene unfolded like a carefully choreographed play, every line rehearsed, every movement designed to spotlight Ivy. "June," Ivy gushed. "We're thinking June. A garden wedding, just like Mom always wanted for me." "That's wonderful." Mom dabbed at her eyes with a napkin, already pulling out her phone to show photos of potential venues. "Leah, you'll need to request time off work. We'll need your help, of course. You'll be maid of honor." I blinked, setting the plate down with more force than necessary. "Actually, I have some news too," I began, my voice steady but firm. "Oh, honey, not now," Mom said, waving her hand dismissively. "Let's focus on Ivy's big moment." I felt the words slip away, swallowed by the familiar tide of their indifference. My hands clenched into fists under the table. Across the room, Jake caught my eye. For a fleeting second, his polished facade cracked, revealing something beneath the charm. A flicker of unease, maybe guilt. Ivy was too busy detailing her dream wedding to notice, and Mom and Dad hung on her every word. I sat quietly, my thoughts tugging back to the unopened email from the biotech firm. It was more than a job offer. It was the culmination of years of work, the key to everything I'd built for myself. But tonight, like every other night, there was no room for me at this table. After dinner, I escaped to the backyard with a glass of wine. The house was alive with laughter and chatter, none of it meant for me. The cool evening air wrapped around me like a balm, soothing the heat of my frustration. I pulled out my phone and opened the email. "Congratulations, Leah Cooper," it began. "We are pleased to offer you the position of lead researcher for our oncology project. This role will begin immediately and require relocation to our New York facility." I stared at the words, letting their weight sink in. This was it, the chance I'd dreamed of, the validation I'd worked so hard to earn. But I knew better than to share it now. If I did, they'd find a way to tether it to Ivy's narrative. They always did. The back door creaked open, and Jake stepped out, cigarette in hand. "Rough night?" he asked, lighting it with shaky fingers. "Shouldn't you be inside planning your perfect wedding?" I replied, more sharply than I intended. He laughed, but it lacked the confidence I'd come to associate with him. "Can I be honest? I hate garden weddings. Ivy loves them, though, and what Ivy wants." His voice trailed off as he exhaled a stream of smoke. "Ivy gets," I finished for him. His silence spoke volumes. The tan line on his wrist caught my attention. The designer watch he'd shown off at our last family gathering was gone. I thought back to his trembling hands during dinner, the way his eyes darted around the room like he was searching for an exit. Something was off. "Everything okay, Jake?" I asked, leaning into the sudden tension between us. "Perfect," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. He took another drag, his hands shaking. Before I could press him, Ivy's voice rang out from inside. Jake, baby. Mom wants to show you the venue pictures. His practiced smile slid back into place, but now I'd seen behind it. Coming, sweetheart, he called, flicking the cigarette into the grass. As he disappeared inside, I looked down at my phone, rereading the email. This time, I wasn't thinking about what the job could do for me. I was thinking about how it might finally free me from all of this. I drained the last of my wine and typed a response. I accept. But as my thumb hovered over the send button, the back door opened again, this time revealing Mom. Leah, she said with a forced smile, stop hiding out here. We need to discuss your dress fitting for the wedding. I pocketed my phone and stood, forcing a calm expression. Sure, Mom, I said, walking toward her. But inside, I felt something shift, a quiet resolve. If they couldn't see me for who I was, then maybe it was time I stopped waiting for them to notice. It was time I made them see. The dining room was abuzz with Ivy's wedding talk when I re-entered the house. My parents were practically glowing as they pored over pictures of venues on Mom's tablet, while Ivy gestured animatedly about color schemes and floral arrangements. Jake sat beside her, his smile faltering slightly every time her eyes darted away. Leah, sit down, Mom said without looking up. We need to finalize the guest list. I took my seat, glancing at my father, who was filling his glass with wine. You'll need to request time off for the whole month of June, he added as though it were an afterthought. Actually, I began, summoning the courage I'd been nurturing since stepping outside. I have some news. Oh, Leah, Mom said distractedly, waving her hand as if brushing off a speck of dust. Can it wait? This is Ivy's moment. The heat rose in my chest, but I pushed it down. It's about a new research position, I said, louder this time. A biotech firm offered me a lead role. It's in New York, starting soon. The room stilled. For a moment, I thought I'd broken through the wall of indifference, but then Mom sighed dramatically. New York? Leah, are you sure that's wise? You're already 28. Isn't it time to start thinking about settling down, like Ivy? Dad chimed in, his tone dismissive. Lab work is fine for now, but you can't build a life on it. Don't you want a family? Ivy leaned forward, a sparkle of condescension in her voice. Oh, speaking of families, guess who I ran into? Remember Tommy Phillips from high school? He's single now, Leah. Maybe I could set you two up? My glass clinked loudly against the table as I set it down, standing abruptly. I need some air. The cool night air hit me like a slap, but I welcomed it. My pulse pounded as I walked to the edge of the yard. The email buzzed in my mind, its possibilities distant yet tantalizing. But as much as I wanted to focus on my own future, the pieces of the evening didn't add up. Jake's missing watch, his shaky hands, and his evasive behavior. Something was off, and I couldn't ignore it. The next day, I sat in Aunt Nancy's office at the bank. She was always a steady presence in our family, someone who saw the truth no matter how much others tried to hide it. Her expression was grave as she slid a folder across the desk. I wasn't sure if I should tell you, she said, her voice heavy with concern. But you need to see this. I opened the folder to find withdrawal slips, loan applications, and transaction records. Each one was tied to Ivy's account, and all bore what appeared to be her signature. My stomach tightened as I recognized the forged handwriting. Jake's been making large withdrawals for months, Nancy said. I brought it up with your mom, but she brushed it off. Said Ivy was handling it. I clenched the edges of the folder. How much are we talking about? Nancy's voice dropped to a near whisper. More than Ivy earns in a year. And it's not just her accounts. She hesitated before sliding another page toward me. Some of these loans were co-signed by your parents. The number at the bottom of the page made my head spin. I thought back to Jake's tan line, his trembling hands, his nervous demeanor at dinner. The pieces clicked into place. He wasn't just in debt, he was drowning. My phone buzzed, jolting me out of my thoughts. It was Ivy. Coffee? Just us. Ivy was already waiting when I arrived at our usual cafe. She looked different, tired, fragile. Her designer handbag was gone, replaced by a worn tote, and she twisted her engagement ring nervously. I need to borrow some money, she blurted before I even sat down. I raised an eyebrow. For what? She hesitated, her eyes darting to the window. Jake's investments. They're just taking longer to pay off than we expected. Investments? I kept my tone neutral, though the folder from Nancy's office flashed in my mind. It doesn't matter, she said quickly. Can you help or not? The amount she named was staggering. It would drain every cent I'd saved for my move to New York. I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. That's everything I have, Ivy. Why would I risk my future for Jake's investments? Her voice cracked. Because you're the smart one, Leah. You always figure things out. I don't have anyone else to turn to. My patience snapped. Do I? Because from where I'm sitting, I've been nothing but invisible to this family. Always cleaning up after everyone else's messes while they barely notice I exist. Tears filled her eyes, and for a moment, I softened. Then my phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Tell your sister time's running out. Jake knows the consequences. I showed it to her, and she went pale. Who are they, Ivy? Her hands shook as she gathered her things. I shouldn't have come, she whispered. Wait. I grabbed her arm, but she wrenched free and rushed out, leaving behind a crumpled receipt. I smoothed it out and froze. It was a pawn shop ticket for a designer watch. That night, as I sat in my car outside my parents' house, I watched Jake's car pull into the driveway. He stumbled slightly as he got out, checking his phone with shaking hands. From inside, I could hear my parents greeting him warmly, their voices full of blind affection. My own phone buzzed. The research firm was following up, asking for my final decision. Their words felt distant, overshadowed by the chaos unfolding in front of me. I started my car, my mind racing. Jake wasn't just irresponsible, he was dangerous. Whatever he had dragged Ivy into was bigger than any of us realized. Sometimes helping means making hard choices, Nancy's words echoed in my mind. And for the first time, I knew exactly what I had to do. The next morning, I drove straight to Aunt Nancy's bank, my heart heavy with a mix of determination and dread. Nancy greeted me with a knowing look as she ushered me into her office. I had a feeling you'd be back, she said, sliding another folder across the desk. Inside was more damning evidence, additional withdrawal slips, forged loan documents, and even a few pawn shop records. One detail stood out, a series of payments to a motel on the edge of town. What's this? I asked, pointing to the line item. Nancy sighed. That's the Silver Moon Motel. Jake's been making regular payments there. I've already alerted the authorities about the forged signatures, but Leah, this isn't just bad financial management. It's criminal. I clenched my fists. Does Ivy know the full extent of this? She suspects, Nancy replied gently. But your parents? They're still in denial. Evelyn told me yesterday that Jake is just having a rough patch. A fresh wave of anger coursed through me. This isn't a rough patch. This is him dragging Ivy, and all of us, into the depths with him. Nancy leaned forward. If you want to help Ivy, you'll need proof that even Evelyn and Robert can't ignore. But Leah, this is dangerous territory. Jake's dealing with people who don't make empty threats. I nodded, my resolve hardening. I'll handle it. Thank you for everything. As I left the bank, I stared at the address of the Silver Moon Motel scribbled on the back of a receipt. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. It was time to see exactly what Jake was hiding. That night, I parked my car across from the Silver Moon Motel, keeping the engine running in case I needed to make a quick escape. The seedy establishment was illuminated by flickering neon lights, and the parking lot was dotted with shadowy figures who seemed to be conducting business that didn't belong on paper. An hour passed before I spotted Jake's car pull in. He emerged, looking as disheveled as I'd ever seen him. His confident swagger was replaced by frantic energy as he clutched an envelope in his trembling hands. Moments later, a man stepped out of the motel, his bulk and menacing demeanor making him look like he moonlighted as a professional enforcer. The two exchanged words I couldn't hear, but Jake's desperate body language told me everything I needed to know. When the man shook his head and stepped closer, Jake flinched, holding out the envelope like it was his last lifeline. The man opened it, counted the cash, and sneered before gesturing aggressively. Jake stumbled backward, nodding rapidly as though making promises he couldn't possibly keep. I grabbed my phone and began snapping pictures through the windshield, documenting every detail. My heart pounded as I watched the exchange unfold. When the man finally walked away, Jake sagged against his car, looking like a man unraveling at the seams. But I wasn't the only one watching. A car parked 2 spaces down flashed its headlights briefly, and I caught a glimpse of the driver. Aunt Nancy. She was on her phone, her expression grim as she typed something with rapid precision. Before I could process her presence, my phone buzzed with a text from her. Come to the bank tomorrow morning. Bring the photos. The next morning, I sat in Nancy's office again. The photos spread out across her desk like pieces of a grim puzzle. She studied them carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. This is worse than I thought, she murmured, tapping a photo of Jake and the enforcer. If he doesn't pay them back, they won't just come after him. They'll come after Ivy, your parents, and anyone else they think can cover the debt. I swallowed hard. What can we do? Nancy slid a new set of papers toward me. I've filed a formal report with the bank and the police. But Leah, this is going to get ugly. Your parents will fight it. They'll defend Jake, at least until they see the full picture. Are you ready for that? I nodded, though my chest felt tight. I don't care what they think anymore. I'm done watching him destroy Ivy's life and mine. That evening, I arrived at my parents' house armed with copies of the photos, loan documents, and police reports. The house was as immaculate as ever, the illusion of perfection still intact. My parents were in the living room with Jake and Ivy, sipping coffee and chatting as though nothing was amiss. Ivy sat stiffly, her hands wrapped around her mug like it was her only anchor. Jake, on the other hand, was all smiles, his charm turned up to full volume. Leah, Mom greeted me. You're just in time. We were discussing some ideas for the wedding. I didn't sit down. Instead, I placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it. We need to talk. Jake's smile faltered as he saw the papers. Ivy's eyes widened. What is this? Dad asked, his tone already defensive. This, I said, pointing to the documents, is proof that Jake has been forging Ivy's signature, draining her accounts, and putting all of you at risk with his debts. Jake stood abruptly. This is ridiculous, he snapped, reaching for the folder, but I snatched it away. I have photos, I said coldly, from the Silver Moon Motel. I saw you hand cash to a man who looked like he breaks kneecaps for fun. Do you want me to show those to the police? Because I will. The room erupted into chaos. Mom gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while Dad demanded an explanation. Ivy stared at Jake, her face pale and stricken. Is it true? She asked, her voice trembling. Jake hesitated, his charm crumbling under the weight of the evidence. Baby, it's not what it looks like, he began, but Ivy cut him off. Don't call me that, she said, standing. Her hands shook as she gestured to the papers. You forged my signature? You stole from me? When Jake didn't answer, Ivy turned to our parents. And you? How could you let this happen? How could you ignore the signs? We were trying to protect you, Mom exclaimed. No, I interjected, my voice steady. You were trying to protect the illusion of a perfect family. And look where that's gotten us. For a moment, no one spoke. The weight of the truth hung heavy in the room. Finally, Ivy took a deep breath. I'm done, she said quietly. With you, Jake. With all of this. She turned to me, tears in her eyes. Thank you, Leah. I nodded, a sense of relief washing over me. But as Jake stormed out, slamming the door behind him, I knew this was only the beginning. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The house fell into a tense silence after Jake stormed out. Ivy sat motionless, staring at the coffee table where the damning evidence still lay scattered. Mom wrung her hands, her carefully crafted composure crumbling. Dad, however, was the first to break the silence. This is a mistake, he said firmly, his voice low but resolute. Jake may have made some bad decisions, but he's still family. I couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped me. Family? Is that what you call someone who forges Ivy's signature, drains her accounts, and puts all of us in danger with his debts? I gestured to the folder. Look at the proof, Dad. You can't deny this anymore. I'm not denying it, he snapped, standing abruptly. But what do you expect us to do, Leah? Throw him to the wolves? That's exactly what he deserves, Ivy interjected, her voice shaking. She stood, her arms crossed tightly. You're still defending him? After everything he's done? After the mess he's dragged me into? Mom placed a trembling hand on Ivy's shoulder. Sweetheart, your father just means we need to handle this delicately. Jake is well, he's still your fiancé. Ivy's expression hardened, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a spark of defiance in her. No, Mom, he's not. I'm done. She turned to me, her voice softening. Leah, is there more I should know? I hesitated. I wanted to protect her from the worst of it, but she deserved the truth. Yes, Jake's debts aren't just financial. He's been dealing with loan sharks, dangerous people. If he doesn't pay them back, they'll come after anyone they think can cover the debt, including you. Ivy's face went pale. What does that mean? It means, I said carefully, you need to cut all ties with him. Now. By the next morning, the situation escalated. Aunt Nancy called to inform me that the police were moving forward with their investigation. Jake's forged documents and financial misdeeds were too blatant to ignore. Meanwhile, Ivy had moved into Nancy's guest house, needing a safe space to process everything. I stayed with her that evening, helping her unpack the few belongings she'd managed to grab from the house she once shared with Jake. She was quieter than usual, her movements slow and deliberate. Do you think I was stupid? She asked suddenly, breaking the silence. For believing him? For not seeing it sooner? I paused, folding one of her sweaters. No, I said honestly. Jake is a master manipulator. He knew exactly how to make you feel like you couldn't live without him. That's not stupidity, it's trust, and he abused it. She nodded, though her eyes were distant. I feel so lost, like I don't even know who I am anymore. I reached for her hand, giving it a firm squeeze. You're stronger than you think, Ivy. You're already taking the first steps to reclaim your life. And I'll be here, every step of the way. Her lip quivered, but she managed a small, grateful smile. Thank you, Leah, for everything. 2 days later, I was back at the Silver Moon Motel. This time, I wasn't just watching from my car, I was waiting. I'd tipped off the police about Jake's dealings, and they were prepared to intervene. My heart pounded as I watched him pull into the lot, his movements jittery and desperate. I stayed low, watching as he met with the same enforcer I'd seen before. Their exchange was heated, with Jake gesturing wildly as though pleading for more time. The enforcer, however, was unmoved. When Jake handed over an envelope, 2 unmarked police cars appeared from the shadows, their lights flashing. Officers swarmed the scene, pinning Jake and the enforcer to the ground. I watched as they cuffed Jake, his protests muffled by the weight of his own actions. As the police hauled him away, one of the officers approached my car. Miss Cooper? He asked, leaning down to the window. I nodded. Did you find what you needed? More than enough, he said. Jake Turner is facing multiple charges, fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to commit extortion. And thanks to your evidence, we've got a solid case. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. What about the loan sharks? They'll be handled too, the officer assured me. But your sister and your family should stay cautious for now. I nodded, the weight of it all pressing down on me. It wasn't over, not entirely, but it was a step toward justice. That evening, I returned to my parents' house. They were waiting for me in the living room, their faces drawn and pale. Mom was clutching a handkerchief, and Dad stood stiffly by the fireplace. What's going on, Leah? Dad asked, his voice strained. We heard about Jake. I placed a copy of the police report on the coffee table. He's been arrested. The evidence was overwhelming. And yes, he's guilty. Mom shook her head, tears streaming down her face. How did it come to this? We trusted him. You trusted him because it was easier than seeing the truth, I said firmly. But ignoring problems doesn't make them go away. It only makes them worse. Dad sank into his armchair, his shoulders slumping. What happens now? Ivy's safe, I said. She's staying with Nancy. But you too. You need to face reality. This family has spent too long pretending everything is perfect. It's time to stop. Mom sobbed into her handkerchief, But for once, she didn't argue. Dad nodded slowly, his expression heavy with regret. "You're right," he admitted. "We failed you both. And I don't know how to fix it." I met his eyes, the weight of years of disappointment and hurt between us. "Start by seeing us for who we are, not who you want us to be." The house was eerily quiet after my confrontation with my parents. It was as if my words had left a crack in their carefully maintained facade, and they didn't know how to piece it back together. For the first time, they seemed to genuinely hear me, but the damage was already done. A week passed, and the fallout from Jake's arrest rippled through our lives. News of his crimes spread through the community, and whispers about the perfect family's unraveling reached even the furthest corners of town. My parents were mortified. Mom called me one afternoon, her voice trembling. "Leah, I don't know what to do. Everyone is talking about us." "About Ivy." "Let them talk, Mom," I said firmly. "You've spent your whole life worrying about what other people think. Maybe it's time to focus on what really matters." "And what does that mean?" she asked, her voice breaking. "It means helping Ivy rebuild her life," I said. "It means facing the truth, even when it's ugly. You can't fix this by pretending it didn't happen." Mom fell silent, and I could hear her stifled sobs through the line. "I just wanted us to be happy," she whispered. "No, Mom," I said gently. "You wanted us to look happy. There's a difference." Meanwhile, Ivy was making slow but steady progress. Staying with Aunt Nancy had given her the space and support she needed to start over. She'd enrolled in therapy, filed for a restraining order against Jake, and even begun exploring job opportunities. One evening, I visited her at Nancy's house. She greeted me at the door with a faint smile. "I made tea," she said, leading me to the kitchen. As we sat at the table, Ivy fidgeted with her mug. "Leah, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice hesitant. I leaned forward, sensing the weight of her words. "What is it?" She took a deep breath. "I knew something was wrong with Jake before we got engaged. There were signs, but I ignored them. I thought if I could just love him enough, everything would be okay." My heart ached at the vulnerability in her voice. "Ivy, that's not your fault. He manipulated you. That's what people like him do." She nodded, tears brimming in her eyes. "But I let it happen because I didn't know how to stand on my own. I've spent my whole life trying to be what Mom and Dad wanted. I didn't even know who I was without their approval." I reached across the table and took her hand. "You're finding out now, and that's what matters." She smiled through her tears, and for the first time in years, I saw a glimmer of the strong, independent person she was becoming. A month later, I received a call from Dad. His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it. "Leah," he began, "your mother and I have been talking. We've started seeing a counselor. Separately for now, but it's a start." I was stunned. My parents, who had spent their entire lives sweeping problems under the rug, were finally taking steps toward change. "That's good, Dad," I said, still processing his words. "And Leah," he continued, his voice thick with emotion, "we owe you and Ivy an apology. For everything. For not seeing you. For putting so much pressure on her. For letting this happen." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. I had waited so long to hear those words, but now that they were here, they felt almost foreign. "I appreciate that, Dad," I said finally. "But it's not just about saying sorry. It's about doing better." "We will," he promised. "I don't know how yet, but we will." 3 months after Jake's arrest, my parents hosted a small family dinner. It wasn't like the grand, orchestrated gatherings of the past. This one was simple, just Ivy, Aunt Nancy, my parents, and me. As we sat around the table, there was a tentative warmth in the air. Mom had cooked one of Ivy's favorite meals, and Dad had even attempted to bake dessert, though it ended up slightly burnt. "Ivy," Mom said softly, "I just want you to know how proud we are of you. For standing up for yourself. For starting over." Ivy blinked in surprise, her fork hovering mid-air. "Thank you, Mom," she said quietly. "And Leah," Dad added, turning to me, "we owe you more than we can ever say. You saved this family." "I didn't do it alone," I said, glancing at Ivy and Aunt Nancy. "And I didn't do it for the family you wanted us to be. I did it for the family we could be." Mom wiped her eyes with her napkin, and for once, she didn't try to hide her tears. I just hope it's not too late, she whispered. It's not, Ivy said firmly. But we have to be honest. With each other. No more pretending. We all nodded, the unspoken promise settling over the table. After dinner, as I helped Mom clear the table, she hesitated before speaking. Leah, she said softly, that research project you worked on in high school, the one about cancer detection, is it still part of your work? I looked at her, surprised. Yes, it's the foundation for what I do now. Why? Her eyes filled with tears. I'd like to hear about it sometime. If you're willing. It wasn't a grand apology or a dramatic reconciliation, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. As I left that night, I felt lighter than I had in years. The cracks in our family were still there, but now, they were filled with something stronger. Honesty, understanding, and the hope of rebuilding. 3 months after that family dinner, life started to settle into a new rhythm. Ivy continued to rebuild her life, balancing therapy sessions with her first job as a project assistant at a local nonprofit. Her confidence was growing, and with it, so was her independence. She'd officially reverted to her maiden name, Ivy Cooper, and had filed for bankruptcy to clear the financial chaos Jake had left behind. For me, work had become my sanctuary. The biotech firm had extended their job offer a second time after hearing of my family situation, and I had accepted. It meant moving to New York for 6 months, but this time, I wasn't running away. I was stepping forward. My project on cancer detection, born out of a high school dream, was now entering clinical trials. Every day brought new challenges, but it also brought purpose. One afternoon, before I left for New York, I stopped by my parents' house. Mom was in the garden, pruning her beloved roses, her movements slower than I remembered, but more deliberate. Leah, she said, looking up with a small smile. I wasn't expecting you. I sat on the edge of the stone bench, watching her work. I wanted to see you before I leave. Her hands stilled, the pruning shears resting against a branch. New York, she murmured, her gaze distant. It's a big step. It is, I said, waiting for the usual lecture about settling down or staying close to family. But it never came. Instead, she set the shears down and turned to me. I was wrong, you know, she said, her voice trembling. All those years, I thought I was protecting this family. But I wasn't protecting anyone. Not really. I was just hiding from the truth. I didn't say anything, letting her words hang in the air. When you were younger, I should have celebrated you more, she continued. Your strength, your intelligence. But I was too busy chasing this idea of a perfect family. And in doing so, I let you disappear. I reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. You see me now, Mom. That's what matters. Tears filled her eyes, and she nodded. I do. And I'm so proud of you, Leah. For the first time, her words felt real. 6 months later, I returned home from New York, my project's trials off to a successful start. The time away had given me clarity, and I was eager to see how things had changed. Ivy met me at Aunt Nancy's house, her face glowing with an energy I hadn't seen in years. Leah, she called, pulling me into a tight hug. How was New York? Busy, I laughed, but worth it. And you? How's life as a nonprofit guru? She rolled her eyes but smiled. It's good. Hard but good. I feel like I'm finally doing something meaningful. Nancy joined us in the kitchen, holding a manila envelope. Before you catch up too much, there's something I want you to see, she said, handing it to me. Inside were court documents, finalized charges against Jake. He had pleaded guilty to multiple counts of fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy and was sentenced to 8 years in prison. Ivy, are you okay? I asked, watching her expression closely. She nodded, her jaw set. I am. It's over now. He can't hurt me, or anyone else anymore. Nancy poured us tea, her smile warm. You two have come a long way. Your grandmother would be proud. The mention of Grandma Cooper brought a bittersweet ache to my chest. I thought of her letter, the one Mom had found in the attic months ago, urging us to break the cycle of perfection. As I sipped my tea, I realized we had finally started to do just that. Later that evening, I visited my parents, Their house felt quieter, more subdued, but there was a peace in the air that hadn't been there before. In the living room, Dad was reading a book, a novel, not the financial papers he used to bury himself in. Mom was knitting, her movements slow but purposeful. They both looked up when I entered. "Leah," Dad said, standing to greet me. "How was the trip home?" "Good," I said, setting my bag down. "How have you two been?" Mom smiled. "Better. Therapy's been enlightening." Dad chuckled. "It's forced us to have some hard conversations, but I think we're finally starting to understand things. About ourselves. About you and Ivy." I sat down across from them, feeling the weight of their sincerity. "I'm glad to hear that. We've been talking about what we missed," Mom added, her eyes misty. "Not just with Ivy, but with you. Your accomplishments, your resilience. Leah, we're sorry for not seeing you sooner." This time, I let the words settle. They weren't perfect, but they were real. "I appreciate that," I said. "And I hope you know, I don't hold it against you. We've all made mistakes. But we're still here." Mom reached for my hand, her grip firm. "Yes, we are. And we're proud of you, Leah, for everything." A week later, we all gathered at Nancy's house for a family dinner. Ivy had cooked, Mom had brought dessert, and Dad had even picked up a bouquet of roses for the table. As we sat down to eat, the conversation flowed easily, free of the tension that had once defined our gatherings. "Ivy," Mom said, raising her glass, "to your new job and your incredible strength. You've taught us all what it means to stand tall." "And Leah," Dad added, smiling at me, "to your groundbreaking work and your unwavering determination. You've always been our anchor, even when we didn't deserve it." I felt my throat tighten as I lifted my own glass. "And to all of us," I said, "for finally seeing each other clearly." As we clinked glasses, I looked around the table at my family. We weren't perfect, but we were real. And for the first time, that was more than enough. The old VHS tape still sat in my drawer, a relic of a past I no longer needed to hide from. It wasn't a symbol of pain anymore. It was a reminder of how far we'd come. Sometimes, the hardest battles aren't about winning or losing. They're about choosing to see, to change, and to heal. And in that quiet resolve, we had found something even better than perfection: each other.